guys, it's season finale time for Why Do I? And what a fun ride it's been. Well, for me at least. Shanks is going to be back on this episode, so I'll ask him a little later how much enjoyment he's been getting out of this. Shanks, you have anything to say before we get started?
No, I've enjoyed this, man. It's been a good run, a good test run, and look forward.
Yeah, and we have a fantastic guest to finish things up. He's the former Delhi bureau chief for Barcroft Media and has written for some of the biggest news publications around. Everything from The Guardian to The Independent, The New York Post, and Sydney Morning Herald. And he's produced documentaries for Nat Geo, TLC, and Channel 4. However, it was a bush behind a hotel in the bylines of Pune that I first met him as we were hiding in wait for a glimpse of Brangelina. I'm just sort of teasing that little story because it's a pretty hilarious story of how we first met. But Sam Relph, great to have you on board. It's been a while since we've known each other. We go back now, almost 15 years. And just before I bring you on, let me give that story a little bit of context, because this was when I was a young reporter in NDTV trying to get any sort of entertainment news at that time. It was, I think, the beginning years of Night Out, one of the first entertainment shows of India. So we were just sort of cutting our teeth. And then I was sent to Pune to cover Brad Pitt and Angelina's shooting of The Mighty Heart. And they wanted us to get any sort of information, interviews, footage, pictures. Once we descended on Pune, we saw a mad rush of media from around the world who were pretty much trying to do the same thing. Except these guys knew exactly the right ways to go about it and how to get it. And it was really funny because, and Sam, please break in anytime I'm mixing up some of the story.
I'm just thinking that I didn't have a clue how to get anything. We were figuring it out as we went along as much as you guys. But they were fun days.
We were looking up to you guys. Every day we'd spend 8 or 10 hours trying to get any glimpse of them. Or they would jump into an auto rickshaw. We'd chase after them, try and get a shot. And then we'd all get together and get smashed on a few beers in the hotel lobby and go through all the stories. And things started coming to a head a few days into it when we weren't getting what we needed. And the bodyguards were getting aggressive with us and they were trying to prevent us from getting access. And I think we finally tried following them into the elevator of the hotel when one of the bodyguards came aggressively running towards us. And this guy was a tough, big Irish guy. And later you should do some research. He's been through some things himself. And he came and I think he looked at me because I was probably the most annoying and most vocal of all the reporters at the time, and came to attack me. And I think something flashed in his mind when he realized that if I hit an Indian reporter here, there's going to be a whole lot of shit to pay. So Sam was standing right next to me, and I think he bore the brunt of it, and he got his neck throttled and pushed up against the wall, and all kinds of furor came. The police arrived. They took interviews. But if you search on Google, that's one of the first few things that'll show up.
Yeah, that's pretty much how it went down. I seem to recall we decided we were going to deliberately take some photographs of the bodyguards.
Yeah.
Just because they wouldn't let us take photos of anyone else. And that's what finally wound them up. And yeah, it was meant to be, the idea was that you were going to provoke them into some kind of story, any kind of story.
Oh yeah. We had strategized this entire thing, that I was going to go and try and needle them and try and get something out of them.
Yeah, because if they wouldn't give us a story about Brad or Angelina, it was figured attacking some Indian journalist would be a story. So it was
exactly
it was Jala that was meant to get the brunt of it, but as you say, they went for the fellow Englishman instead.
And it's hilarious because later I was misquoted by the police and the media saying that apparently they threatened us saying, "You bloody Muslims," which I never said that they said. I think they may have said, "You bloody Indians." But somehow that was taken out of context, and that's what you're going to see in every sort of news report. But finally, they did give in somewhat. They said, okay, we'll have a little press conference for the Indian journalists, a few of the big media outlets. And Shanks, is a funny story because once we went for that press conference, my company, NDTV, said at the time, you have to ask them if they're going to adopt a kid in India. Because they were seen going into an orphanage in Pune, whatever, and they said, no matter what you do, you cannot come back without finding out this answer. As soon as we start the press conference, Brad Pitt's presser and Angelina's there and the cast of the movie Mighty Heart. And the first thing they say is, no questions apart from the movie itself. We're not going to answer anything else. And I'm like, oh, damn, I'm going to get into so much trouble back in office for this. So I waited patiently and I was like, how do I spin this? How do I do this? So finally I was like, there are rumors that you've come to Pune to adopt an Indian child. I just want to say, Angelina, if there's any truth to it, I'm available. And then suddenly they all started laughing. And then suddenly one person's like, yeah, no, I don't think that's going to happen this trip, whatever.
Oh,
but
wow.
it became this whole joke. So that was quite funny. So that's the context of how Sam and I met first. And it became a story of my own personal journey for somehow reason. But I think it's such an interesting path that you've taken from those days and now into this rarefied air of writing for these, really renowned publications and seeing it on the ground in India. I mean, that perspective must have been kind of life-changing for you.
Well, yeah, I mean, India changed a hell of a lot of things for me because the funny thing is I never planned any of it. I don't think I've really planned anything in my entire life, but certainly even reporting from India wasn't something that I planned. I went to India on holiday, spent £500, took a backpack, went to India on holiday, and I ended up staying for 8-9 years. And that was, being a journalist was basically my passport to be able to continue to stay and to turn it around and start working there. But the India that I arrived in, I didn't have a clue what it was about. I mean, absolutely nothing. I knew close to nothing about India because, again, my general travel preparations are to land somewhere and then figure it out. I don't tend to read guidebooks or anything like that. Just go and speak to people and, see what a place is about. That was what I was going to do in India. And as I say, or as you say, it ended up being this nearly 10-year journey where I went from, just some unemployed freelance reporter into building an agency in India and making documentaries and doing all sorts of things. But every single aspect of that was unplanned. And the advantage is that you get to travel into the most remote and the most unusual corners of India as a journalist and report on things and see things that you wouldn't ever see as a tourist. You wouldn't ever see, even plenty of Indians don't get to, how many people from Delhi decide to go to the middle of Bihar just for a story? Most people don't travel to those places. So, yeah, I mean, I sort of picked things up and learned about India as I went along. And, the change both in my understanding of the country, but also the country itself over the last, 15 years now, it's been remarkable. It's been a privilege to watch.
How do you not be completely lost when you first arrive? The culture shock, the language, how do you report in a country that you have sort of no background knowledge? So what were your tactics to overcome those boundaries?
Well, I mean, as I said, I didn't do any reporting in India for the first 12 months that I was there. I was traveling. So I gradually learned to understand more and more. But I mean, in terms of how do you not be overwhelmed, I think that's the whole point of India. You will be. I'd traveled to quite a few places before I first landed in India. And, everybody talks about the culture shock, but it's true. You can travel to Thailand or Cambodia or other parts of Asia where, as a foreigner, you can still pretty much guess how it's going to work. You can pretty much guess the rules, even if you don't really know the country. In India, that's not true. There's an entirely new set of rules that are underwritten. The way that the world really works, from being able to get Airtel to learning to carry passport bloody photos with you all the time to everything else. So you learn about it. And I mean, from my point of view, I just asked people questions and made friends and started to understand more and more about the country as I went along. But yeah, I landed in Delhi in, I think it was June or something like that. So, I mean, the temperature was absolutely extraordinary. And the first thing I did was I bought a motorbike because that's the really sensible way to get to know India is to fall off motorbikes as you ride around the country.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, sounds very sensible. Trying to navigate.
Classic British thing to do as well. I think every Brit I've known coming to India, first thing in Enfield.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I didn't know I could do that. That wasn't even part of my plans when I was coming to India. I'd been in Southeast Asia before I came, and I'd been in Vietnam doing some kind of story there. I can't remember why I went there now. But I met some British guy who was living and working in Vietnam, and he'd got this old Russian motorbike that he was riding around the city, and I became friends with him, and he used to take me around the city. And I said, I just thought that was an amazing way to see Vietnam. And he said, well, if you're going to India, they do Enfields over there. You can just buy one and ride around. I didn't know. So I landed, and 24 hours later I had a bike, and I was off up to do Manali, Leh, into Kashmir, eventually ended up down in Goa. And so, I kind of learned about India through necessity, because if you're going to not have a license and not know how Indian roads work and then get on an Enfield, it's a baptism by fire.
How did you even survive that? Did you come through relatively unscathed? I mean,
I've got a few scars. I've got a few scars from the experience. It was pure luck.
Mentally and physically.
Yes, yeah, exactly. But it was pure luck, and that's pretty much my story of India. What I learned is that you can't try to impose your own set of rules in terms of how you want things to work, whether you're reporting a story or whether you're living in Delhi as I was or whatever. You just have to kind of let India take you with it a little bit, because otherwise you're just going to get worn out fighting.
Yeah, exactly. You can't fight it. You just have to kind of roll with the punches here. So what were those kind of initial stories when you did start after a year? What was the kind of stuff you were reporting on?
Well, what I did, because up until I got to India, which was 2006, and I guess I started reporting around about 2007, every foreign correspondent who, as far as I know, had ever been to India tried to do this sort of the serious, the politics, the culture, the highbrow India story about all of the history and all the rest of it. And it was quite weird reporting on India at that time because it was that kind of stuff. And I often worked for tabloid newspapers who didn't give a shit about any of that. If a story was to make it into a tabloid newspaper, it needed to be unusual, quirky, weird, colourful, of which there's loads in India. I don't think I've ever told anyone this apart from the people I was working with. So what I did is I bought the Limca Book of Records and I went through it from cover to cover and found the weirdest, most unusual, freakiest, batshit crazy stuff happening. And we just literally took that and went and found these people and did those stories at the beginning. And nobody had ever seen it coming out of India. That kind of sort of, it was a bit flippant. It was a bit funny. There were, I seem to recall there was a kid who roller skated under cars. He just he completely did the splits and then bent his head forward and then literally roller skated underneath cars. We were like, well, that's, we went and found him and got about a line of about 20 cars, sent him underneath all of them. And it was really funny pictures and really funny video.
That is brilliant.
But were you trying to figure out what drove him to do that? Was it just the thought of fame and being in the Limca Book of Records? Or there was some sort of, figured he had some knack for it? Like, how does that even come about?
I can't remember how, but we did. We used to do a decent interview and find out, because that's the first question. I can't remember the answer now, but it's like, what? Why?
Exactly why?
And there's loads of those kinds of things happening in India, and nobody had reported that stuff before. Everyone was doing the really serious politics kind of stuff. So I inadvertently, again, completely unplanned, basically I'd run out of money. So I either had to go home or find a way to earn a living. So I got in touch with a friend who ran an agency in the UK, Barcroft Media. I said, do you fancy anything from India? And he said, yeah, sure, if you can find something. But it wasn't going to be the stuff that, in journalistic terms, if Reuters or AP or any of those big international news agencies are covering something, then there's no need to buy from an independent agency. So we had to find stuff that was unusual. And that's, so I just went around, I started just traveling around India. I was on the road the whole time, just finding the unusual, quirky, weird bits of life. And they were rarely in the cities. So I was always in sort of villages and tier 3 towns and wherever. And so it was quite an introduction. And it's not the sort of introduction to India that most journalists get, because most of them know they're being posted for a start and do some research. I didn't. And most of them are, doing that slightly more serious take in life. And sometimes I used to miss that because after a while, everything started repeating itself because there's only so much of that stuff you can do without it starting to feel a bit tired and cliched. I just got to see India as it changed over the years. And it's quite, it's interesting for me to sort of live there and be an outsider and yet start to know more and more about the country. And then, essentially, I ended up getting married to an Indian woman. So I've got Indian in-laws and Indian family. And that's when you really start finding out, when you truly, anywhere, when you live among the people, that's when you start to really understand the country and understand the people when you're living with them. And again, that was unplanned, but that's, I started to just understand more about India, kind of living with an insider, but still being a bit of an outsider. So it was a fairly unusual way to view the country, I guess. Second time I came back, I had 2 stints in India. And certainly the most recent time that I was back pre-coronavirus, pre-lockdown, I was looking much more at the environment and climate change and the things that interest me. To do that, if you've got a job, then you do what the employer tells you. And if you want to go freelance, then you take those risks, but you get an opportunity to do the sort of stuff that you want to do, and you can write for anybody doing it. So, that was it for me. And the other thing as well, to be fair, when I was in India before, we had those sorts of stories. But then there's also any time a British person died in India or got into trouble in India, we'd cover that as a kind of hard news story. We'd do the celebs if they turned up and they were famous enough. And, I mean, there were occasions when something dramatic, I mean, the Mumbai terror attacks, for example, there were occasions, I mean, I wasn't in Pune, I was in Nagpur when the Mumbai attacks happened. So I remember it very clearly because I was the only person getting to the airport trying to get to Bombay. Everybody's going back the other way, and I had an empty flight to the city, with everybody queuing in Bombay trying to get out. And driving through Mumbai as that was going on, we got there the morning after the night before when it started. So there was that kind of stuff. So it's not like I was only doing the kind of stories I became renowned for. Sorry, I don't know if you heard that.
Was that like a truck backing up?
Yes, apologise for that.
No worries.
Yes, I mean, it's not like I was only doing one type of story particularly. And, I got to know the police stations and all the rest of it pretty well when Brits got up to trouble in India, and there's plenty of other stuff as well. But after a while, I think after a while, I just got kind of bored of being a journalist, actually. I mean, it wasn't so much as what I was doing. It was you can become quite cynical inside the news industry as to how it operates.
So what are these things that like jade you as a journalist? I mean, I want to get your sort of take on what your thoughts are on Indian media and Indian journalism in general as well. Like how different it is from the time you started to what it is now. Is it elements of that actually jaded and make you cynical? Because I can see like the life of a journalist and the kind of stories you do really weighing on you. And the way the reporters kind of hound and fiend for stories and will do whatever it takes to get that, it can be kind of disillusioning.
It can, and particularly when you don't really care or believe in the story. So if it's something you're really passionate about, that's probably different. You've probably got a bit more fire in your belly. But sometimes you're doing stuff that just seems ludicrous. Chasing somebody for a single quote when they're not going to give you a quote, and the whole thing becomes a circus. And that's true. That's true all over the world. I mean, I think that's the interesting thing about Indian journalism. It's in a way, it is kind of representative of the country. And the thing about India is it's in every circumstance, at every opportunity, more extreme in every direction, all at the same time than anywhere else you will ever go.
There are no rules.
And no rules, absolutely fucking crazy most of the time, which is brilliant fun. But that is the country, and the journalism does kind of reflect the country. Which I guess you might be able to see that. Maybe that reflects all over the world as well. The kind of, the journalism reflecting the culture that it's born in. So Indian journalism has always been like that. It's always been colourful and crazy and, 24/7 non-stop. Because, I mean, essentially from an Indian point of view, by the time you got past DD1 and DD2, suddenly you had satellite TV and suddenly there were loads of news stations all over the world. So I think it exploded in India, the modern media at least, as soon as satellite TV came, which I wasn't there for. But again, it's the stories you pick up from the Indian family. But you can see that it was just, there's a huge amount of energy in Indian media. There's a huge amount of money in it. I think the change has happened in that there seemed to be, when I first arrived, there was still the serious media that tried to analyze things and hold themselves up to the highest international standards. Whether or not they achieved it, that was certainly the aim, and you could tell that. And I see less of that now, and some of those more experienced journalists that were around when I was first in India, Barcroft, Rajdeep Sardesai, they're no longer there. There's no room for them in the Indian media landscape anymore. So it's changed quite dramatically from the personnel in the Indian media, but also the way it seems to be operating. There seems to be an awful lot more screechiness and sensationalism in Indian media now. And again, it's about the balance, I think. And again, it's not an Indian problem specifically. You can see it reflected certainly in America, and Australia is one, other countries. The UK is not immune to that kind of thing, although TV-wise it's a bit more quieted down. But India is not the only country that has this problem. But again, as with everything with India, it's often at a more extreme and a louder decibel. So I think India often reflects global problems or global shifts, if you like. You can see that in politics and media. So India's not sort of bucking the trend, I don't think, in anything. But it's often an outlier because it's just a more extreme example of life generally. I mean, that's the best way I can explain India anyway to anybody that would ever ask. It's like, well, anything that you're talking about in any direction, from food, fucking spicy. Not a little bit, really fucking hot. Traffic, really fucking crazy. But the high achievers, really fucking high achievers,
There's no middle ground. There's no middle ground for anything in India, Chris.
Exactly. So it's good or bad, or any emotion you want to experience, anything at all, India will take it to extremes. It always does. It's just in the nature of the country or the people. And the media actually, I think, reflects that in a sense, that national characteristic. And that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. That's just how it is. But yeah, the media landscape in India definitely has changed, and it's definitely become a lot more sensationalist. And that's not always positive. It's not that you shouldn't have the sensational kind of stories in kind of news channels or newspapers or whatever, but it would be nice to have that balance between the more serious end and the more sensationalist end. And I think that's probably lacking now. It's become less so. And again, that's not, like I say, that you can see that elsewhere in the world as well, but India's probably quite extreme when it comes to the sort of the distrust in the news media as well, that kind of stuff. But that's really changed. That wasn't the same 15 years ago. So, there's been a progression there. Regression, yes. A revolution.
No, but you're right. It's a global issue. You see it happening all over the world, and it seems like people are just taking less stock into accountability. People are being brazen about, when I say people, I mean news outlets, journalists, reporters, just seem to be brazenly pushing some sort of propaganda or agenda without thought of consequences. And it all seems to be politically driven. And I know, this is where Shanks is. I can see Shanks stretching his shoulders and his neck muscles, trying to get a word in here because...
No, this is for me, why I was excited to speak to Sam about this whole thing is just get a perspective on where we stand right now. I think it's got to a point in India where news media, television news media especially, is at a dangerous point. I think we've seen the last 6 months to a year wherein news media has just forgotten their ethical responsibilities completely, entirely, whether it's this Bollywood suicide case or whether it's the anti-CAA protests and any kind of political activism is being taken by news media, and you're seeing a lot of agendas added to it, just like what you guys are talking about right now. And I do agree with you that we're mirroring a lot of trends in America, Australia, other countries. But as a citizen, as a young person in India, I think it's just reached a point where I have zero faith in mainstream media.
Yeah.
And it's also causing a lot of destruction to society. It's eroding the very fabric of society. And it's a young country. We have 60% of our population is below 30. So if they are going to be influenced like this, we've got a troubled future coming. So I would like to get your perspective on this, and just how did you see this whole thing change? What were those milestones where you saw things change? Obviously, politically, things have changed here dramatically over the past decade.
There was an obvious difference in the air. Is the only way I can kind of explain it. It just felt different. Very much the same country, of course, but the undertone it changed. And I'm trying to put my finger on it, but you walk around CP or something, and it seemed a little bit more on edge, not quite as free-spirited as when I first arrived. I think when I first arrived, there was this real feeling. It was like, internationally, it was kind of the India shining moment. But there's a real feeling that outsourcing was an absolute boon to India. Wages were rising massively. It was getting more attention in international press. More businesses were trying to open up in India. And there was a really optimistic feeling in the air. And you could feel it from everybody. Whether you spoke to school kids or a taxi driver, everybody expected everyone expected their kids' lives would be better than theirs, and that everything was going to get better. And so it was a very positive time. And that permeated just about everywhere, from villages to the city. And I think that positivity had kind of, I didn't feel it the second time around. There was a much more general feeling of anger and distrust and of broken promises. Because, I mean, if you look at it now, and again, this is always going to happen, whichever political persuasion you take, the amount of people coming into India's workforce every month, there's not enough jobs. And there never was going to be. The outsourcing was never going to be able to provide the jobs for the amount of people that are entering India's workforce every month. And you can feel that disillusionment. And again, there's a global aspect to this, and India is a more extreme example for different reasons, perhaps. But I mean, the hollowing out of American cities was partly to do with outsourcing and offshoring. And India benefited a lot from that. India then became more expensive as a result, and Indian living standards rose, less interest in outshoring, and then you've got a global recession, and suddenly, India's in a quite a difficult position now economically, and that was before the pandemic hit. So I mean, the pandemic is what it is, but so there was a difference in direction. The growth wasn't as much as it had been, and there seemed to be a much more sort of pessimistic feeling. People felt more taken advantage of by events. So I think the country has changed quite a lot in terms of its atmosphere. And then, and when we're talking about the media, I mean, in some senses, the media leads that, but also plays into that feeling because, they're appealing to an audience because, the media, and again, that's another issue, but the media is up against entertainment channels. So when you get that kind of financial
windfall from being sensationalist.
Yeah, and it feeds into, you watch the Indian news channels there today, there's an awful lot of anger and viciousness sometimes, on those channels. And certainly, it's an age-old argument. Does the news media lead the country or lead the audience, or do they reflect the audience? Who knows? But there certainly seems to be a bit more anger in the country as well, and less sort of hope for the future, actually, that is compared to 2006, 2010.
It's very distracted. I mean, news media today is very, very distracted. There are a lot of things we want to talk about, we want to hear about. The economy, like you said, jobs is such a priority. The environment, climate change has had a serious effect. A city like Delhi is literally unlivable at times. So there are some real issues here. And I think we'd reached a point where we were tackling them. That was the discourse. That discourse has entirely changed. We're discussing very divisive subjects. We're discussing subjects that don't really... media has turned into literally a reality TV show.
But I'll tell you why, Shanks. It's also because the media is the megaphone of the government in a lot of ways. So the government wants you to hear what they want you to hear at the moment, and they want to distract you from the larger issues, which will cost them some sort of larger play. And this is like everywhere. You see the biggest countries in the world now, what are they feeding off is your hate, is your fear, is your divisiveness. And they're trying to focus on that. And the larger issues that you're talking about, which you really need to focus on, get thrown under the rug.
Sidetracked.
Yeah.
I'd say that is a noticed difference this in the last 10 years. Is if you go back to 2010, for example, there was serious criticism of government, of the Prime Minister. There's not anymore, and there would appear to be multiple reasons for that, including potentially, fear, being silenced, self-censorship.
A lot of dissent is being clamped down on. I think there's a lot more dissent against the government right now, but it's just there aren't enough channels for it. Yeah, I think, the last few months, if they have anything to say, we've seen a lot of political activists been targeted. They've gone for them, and it's not an easy place to voice yourself now. If you're labeled as anti-national if you question your government. I don't understand how the government has become the country.
And it's very fascinating because I was seeing on one of the Joe Rogan podcasts recently, he was talking about something in America called the Patriot Act. And he said by the very nature, by calling it the Patriot Act, it's biased already. It means anything you try and say against it is unpatriotic. So it's like, that is the kind of mindset that they're trying to feed into.
Totally. And again, the interesting thing is that India is at one of the more extreme ends of a global trend, but anti-nationalism, call it what you like, is, the government persecuting citizens because of so-called anti-national feeling is happening all over the world. And India's not the worst country for it, but it's getting to the stage where it's a noticeable political change, and the media doesn't seem to sort of care or cover that very much.
Which is shocking, and it's scary.
It's not. That's the right word. It's terrifying that we're living in an age where you can't voice dissent, you can't protest for fear of just being. See what's happening, and obviously been happening in Russia for many years. Anybody who tries any form of dissent is poisoned almost immediately and silenced. But that's happening here. And the worst part is, at least it's making the world global news when it happens in Russia. When in India, people are getting killed off, being silenced, being jailed. Nobody's covering it. Nobody's bothered.
And that's true globally as well. It's a weird thing, but it's like the international news media kind of, and I don't think it's a deliberate thing. It's just perhaps human nature and how people work. But they've got in their head that India is a big, crazy democracy. And the country doesn't seem to fit the international image at the moment. And the result seems to be that people are just ignoring it, really. I mean, like you say, Russia gets reported internationally all the time, China all the time, Brazil quite often, Turkey. But India, largely people seem to have just stopped talking about India in terms of global news, which is weird, but it's almost like it doesn't fit the image that people need to have of India, because if India is a problem, then it's, globally speaking, I mean, if India becomes a problem, then
it affects everyone.
Well, and it's unfixable. No one internationally can do anything about it.
But I do believe that's also because people look at developing countries as, they have their problems because that's what they've sort of, they're not a progressive country to the thing that's what is expected.
It's looked at as teething issues.
It's the same thing when you hear stories come out of Africa. People give it far less credence or whatever it may be, because it's like, Africa, they go through that every day.
Totally. There's a fear of being labelled racist, let's face it, among a lot of it, just because those accusations can get thrown around so easily on social media nowadays. You can be labelled anything. I think there's a general feeling international, everywhere, of trying not to say things that are going to get, caught on, that are going to just get you hounded off Twitter or abused.
Essentially, don't take a stance. Just be stanceless your entire life.
Yeah, be bland. And the sort of left-wing trolls on social media are at least as vicious as the right-wing, if not more so. But yeah, but there's a very much an element of that, of, if you're the white, middle-class, English, American, whatever, male voice, and you criticize, in this day and age, and certainly in the UK and certainly in the US, you criticize anyone brown for anything, there's a small minority that will just, and it starts to stick and it starts to piss people off. And so it's easier not to criticize, which I think in some ways is why it's easier for, I mean, I don't include myself in this because I'll criticize India as much as I fucking well like. I love the country. I've lived there. And where there's criticism due,
you've earned the right to.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, if you spend that amount of time in a country, then I think you do earn the right to have an opinion.
A son-in-law of the country, so why bloody not?
Absolutely. So I feel very happy. So I will criticize India, but an awful lot of people will feel that if you criticize sort of India, Africa, anything that's browner, an element of an easy attack line there. Whereas perhaps if you're English or American, you criticize a white country like Russia, I don't know. But there does seem to be that sort of thing. No, if you criticize India, then you don't understand the culture, or you're not paying attention. Also,
our ability to take criticism of any kind is not very good, especially from an institutional side of things. If this government or any other institutions, we're very weak in our ability to take criticism and sort of implore that criticism and kind of implement new things from there. Criticism is looked at as, we get a bit defensive. And I don't see that as a sign of progressiveness. It's where we need to be able to take criticism.
Which is why I see so many parallels with what's happening in America right now, because they behave in the same way in a lot of ways, right? A lot of the issues that are facing them, we're kind of facing as well. Like, I don't even know if America is a developed country anymore. You know what I mean?
But I think there are parallels. But I mean, it's something I've thought of a few times actually. Is, again, when I first arrived in India, there was a very deferential feeling and attitude towards white foreigners.
Yeah, of course.
As a white guy in India, I could get away with anything I wanted back in 2000.
But that's still the case, right? Not much has changed.
Much less so now. But I think what I've noticed is, so before, and I think it's about the self-confidence in terms of, like, you can take it individually, but sort of nations have their own characteristics. And there was a definite lacking of self-confidence when I first arrived, and it showed as deferential to white countries and white foreigners. And now I think there's India's sort of grown up a bit, and Indians have grown up a bit, and the youth is no longer. I think the feeling is, or the attitude has changed, and I think there still is a certain amount of lacking confidence sometimes, but it's turned into more of a kind of "fuck you, don't you criticize me" kind of attitude.
Yeah,
chest thumping kind of. Yeah, like,
I mean, there's two ways that confidence can come out in two ways, right? You're either confident about yourself, you're happy to take criticism and sort of be part of a global dialogue, but the other way is this whole chest thumping. You don't know what you're talking about. You can't tell me what it's about. And that's just,
how dare you?
Yeah, it's a bit negative.
Yeah, and not being up for the argument. Just
did you ever face that personally?
No, not really. I got away without any. I've never had any problems in India, really. So it's stuff that you see. But I mean, and this is the other thing. What we're talking about at the moment is a kind of national trend or characteristic or whatever we're talking about. But you go to an individual Indian house or you meet almost anyone individually.
Very different.
Totally different. The hospitality is still there. The personalities haven't changed, but the national trend seems to have. But if you go to the shop or you meet somebody and they invite you into their house, or as I did last year, you just end up going into some weird little village on a reporting job. The hospitality is still there. The chai still comes out. People are still interested. It's still, so it's like people haven't really changed, but
the narrative's changed.
The narrative has changed and the national feeling has changed, and yet the people haven't. So it's quite weird like that.
I feel like you've hit some nail on the head. That's a saving grace. I mean, just as a country, if you look at our history over the past 2,000 odd years, we've seen a lot of foreign influences come in, come in again. And I think the very fabric of us as Indians hasn't really changed that much. There's a lot of things we've picked up, we've ditched, but our fabric as secular people hasn't really changed. We've always been accepting of different faiths, different types of peoples, different skin colors. I mean, we've been like that, and which is
have we though? Have we been that?
I mean, we have in the larger timeline. We have, which is why I still have faith in our people as a collective, where this divisiveness will pass, and I think we'll be able to hold on to some sense of dignity.
I know, I completely agree with you that actually, if it was left just up to the people are very open and welcoming. It's just that a lot of and that comes from education, that comes from what your politicians are telling you. That
culturally, we're tuned like that.
It's what a lot of outside voices are telling you to hate and to divide. And this caste is different, and this religion is different, and their beliefs are different, and therefore you must hate and you must not accept. That's all been fed into our psyche. I don't think that's what we are actually as a people, is what you're trying to say. Right?
Exactly.
No, I mean, I completely agree with that. But then again, just look at what India actually is. Because if you're talking about the land and the culture and the people, millennia old, and it's always been a case of, different influences. It's a melting pot. I mean, that's what made India. But then on the flip side of that, if you look at what India actually is, it's a country that is exactly the same age as Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's really young. The same age as Arnie. That's how old India is.
I mean, the Republic of India.
Yeah. And so if you look at the political side of it, if you look at democracy in India, it's very, 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 very young. And I mean, you could argue it's potentially being threatened a little bit at the moment. But, democracy in India itself is a very, very young concept. Actually, if you look at the age of the land and the age of the culture and the age of the people and the influences, democracy may stay, it may be a flash in the pan. But the culture itself and the people themselves haven't changed, because that's the culture is one of the strongest in the world. Along with China, Indian history stretches back to the start of time. And also, if we look at the way the world is going in any number of things, from climate to the future of work with more machine learning and more robots, less humans needed, I think there's going to be some really profound changes just that we can't do anything about. We're just going to have to adapt to. Coronavirus is just a little taste of what the likely changes over the next, say, 20 years.
We've got plagues, floods, fires, earthquakes,
all the fun stuff.
It's like biblical, man. Thank you for being our final guest on season 1.
Oh, you're welcome. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and yeah, definitely share us the link whenever it goes live.